Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and I'm here to do a review on the Bersa Thunder Pro 9mm compact. But before I get into that, as is sometimes my habit here on the Reformed GGA channel, we're going to first have a reading from God's Word. This passage comes from Luke, and it will be the 22nd chapter, starting in verse 35. And this is speaking of Jesus talking to his 12 disciples. It says, "And he said to them," that is, Jesus said to his disciples, "When I sent you out with no money bag, or knapsack, or sandals, did you lack anything?" They said, "Nothing." They said, "We lacked nothing." He said to them, "But now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that the scripture must be fulfilled in me." And the scripture is, "And he was numbered with the transgressors. For what is written about me has its fulfillment." And they said, "Look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, "It is enough." There's a lot of debate concerning that passage, and those of you who know me know that I'm obviously I'm a conservative Reformed Christian, and I'm also a proponent of the Second Amendment. And there are some people who believe that the Bible, especially the New Testament, is kind of antithetical to a pro-Second Amendment position, that it's more pacifistic. And there are those who are like myself that see it as being very pro-Second Amendment, both the Old Testament and the New Testament. And that particular passage is one that's in dispute. You have Jesus talking to his disciples before he is going to be led off to execution. This is right before that happens, right before he's arrested. And he's saying to them, okay, before when I sent you out, I didn't ask you guys to take anything, just go out and live off the land, basically. Live off of the generosity of the people into which I'm sending you. And then he says, now I'm changing that. Now you need to understand that the world is fundamentally going to be against me, so you need to take due measures to take care of yourself. Now you need to start carrying a knapsack. You need to make sure that you have extra provisions with you. And among the provisions that he mentions is a sword. And that is very interesting. Now, sadly, the disciples misinterpreted it. Jesus saying, okay, now you should go and get a sword. They seem to have interpreted it as, okay, well, we've got 2. Is this going to be enough to have our, religious revolution? And Jesus is like, no, that's enough. You're kind of missing the point. He was talking about the spiritual message that he was bringing, going out. He wasn't necessarily talking about a physical revolution or anything like that, and sadly the disciples misunderstood that. But Jesus still gives the advice, if you don't have a knapsack, get one and take it, which is very practical advice for what they were going to be encountering. And he also gives them the practical advice, if you don't have a sword, sell what you have in order to get one. And like I said, it's a very controversial topic. Some people will put it strictly in terms of the figurative. Figuratively, he was just telling his disciples to be prepared. But when we look at the disciples afterwards, after Jesus is brought to trial, after Jesus is executed and he raises from the dead and ascends, what do we see the disciples going out? We see the disciples doing. We see them going out into the world. And we go them. And ostensibly, they're going out prepared. They're doing things like taking knapsacks with them. That part of it seems to have been very practical advice that they seem to have taken. Why not the part about the sword? Okay, does this mean that they're going to go into a town to tell them about Jesus, and if you don't accept Jesus, we're going to kill you with the sword? No. That was never the Christian mentality, and you see that throughout the New Testament. That was not the Christian mentality. But the idea of taking a tool to defend yourself on the way, not that we promote our religion by means of the sword, but that we preserve our own safety by means of the sword, that seems to have very much been a part of that suggestion on Jesus' part. If you don't have a means of protection, get one. I'm not sending you out as I did before. I'm not sending you out to, resting upon the welcome of the people that you're going to. Instead, I'm sending you out into a rather brutal world that will be against you because of me, and you need to take due steps to defend yourself, and that fits with Old Testament themes as well. There are many passages in the Old Testament where the people of God defend themselves and are called to defend themselves. Does this mean that they're going out and trying to conquer the world as a whole, to enforce Judaism throughout the world by military conquest? No, they're not doing that. But when other peoples come against them, they do defend themselves militarily. And when they're first going into the Promised Land, they are moving out the evil, tyrannical people by means of force, by use of weapons. And so even though that passage that we just talked about from Luke 22, starting in verse 35, is indeed very controversial, it does fit with the rest of the Bible as a whole in saying that, no, Christians very much so are allowed to defend themselves. It does not condone violence in the name of religion. No, we're not saying that if you don't happen to accept Christianity, we're going to kill you. No, that's not the way it works. It's been the case with some other religions in the past, and sadly there's been some people who have misinterpreted Christianity in the past that way. That's not what the text is talking about. The text is saying that you do have a right and indeed a responsibility to take due precautions for a given situation, and protecting yourself from thieves, robbers, and bandits that you might happen to encounter along the way is a part of due provision. That was allowed for biblically. All right, so enough talk about that. Very interesting. And I encourage you to ponder on that for a little bit longer. But if we ponder on that for too long, we will never get to the review of the Bersa. So let's go ahead and get into that. This is my new Bersa. It's a Bersa Thunder Pro 9mm compact. And I have it in an Uncle Mike's cloth inside the waistband holster. This is a size 16, by the way. It's a little big for the gun, but it's not too bad. Okay. And let's go ahead and check and make sure that this gun is safe. As you can see, there's no magazine in it. We'll go ahead and lock the slide open. Make sure that the chamber is clear, and I can feel that the chamber is clear, so this is a safe gun. Alright, so this is a new gun that I bought, and the reason why I bought this gun is because sometimes my company sends me into a jurisdiction where a lot of my other guns are not allowed because of magazine capacity. Now this gun, as well as one other of my guns, also happens to have a magazine capacity that's okay, but this gun holds 13 rounds in its magazine. Now this is one of the magazines. As you can see, that's just the follower. It is not a loaded magazine. But this is one of the magazines that it takes. It comes with 2 of these, and it's 13 rounds, and that is legal in that jurisdiction that I'm talking about. Like I said, I do have one other gun that is also legal in that jurisdiction in terms of magazine capacity. However, I have a problem with that other gun. It's a CZ75 compact, which is a fantastic gun, reliable. It was actually my first ever handgun. The only problem that I have with it is that there are certain ways that I carry it that are not very comfortable. When I put it in one of my cargo pants pockets, my CZ75 compact is fantastic. It's just great. But when I try to do some kind of inside the waistband carry with that gun, it has this thin metal tang, which helps keeping your hand away from the action of the gun. But when I'm carrying it, that thin metal tang that it has, which is pretty long, digs into my side. Excuse me. I've been dealing with allergies for the past couple of days. I went shooting out in the desert, all the sagebrush and all the pollen going on, and yeah, it's not been good. But that aside, getting back to the Bersa, like I said, I bought it because of a particular jurisdiction that my company sends me to that has magazine limits. I have one other gun that is legal in that jurisdiction, but it's not a very convenient gun to carry, and certainly not a very comfortable gun to carry. Like I said, if it's in cargo pants pockets, it's fine. But if I try to do anything that's on my hip and I happen to bend a little bit, the other gun has a pretty serious and fairly thin metal tang on it, and it really digs into you, and it's not pleasant. So I wanted to get a gun that didn't have that very long, skinny metal tang on it. And I also wanted a gun that had fairly low capacities so that it would meet the requirements of that jurisdiction. And started doing some looking around, and this is what I came up with. Like all of my other guns, it is hammer fired. I prefer hammer fired over striker fired. You know, people say that, you know, striker fired is the technologically advanced thing, but to a certain extent it's true. I'm not saying that it isn't. But there are certain qualities of striker-fired guns that I don't like, and that is that they usually don't give you a whole lot of options. That can vary from model to model, and from company to company, of course. But by and large, striker-fired guns, what basically happens is you load the gun, you rack the slide, and it's ready to go, and pull the trigger and bang, and that's pretty much all there is to the operation. You don't have many options aside from that. Either it's ready and it's in a ready to fire condition, or it's not. That's pretty much it with a striker fired gun. And anecdotally at least, most of the time when I hear that things go wrong with a sidearm, it's usually with a striker-fired gun, when people have an accidental discharge when they're putting it back into their holster. Oftentimes it's a striker-fired gun. When they have a negligent discharge when it's outside of the holster, it's very often a striker-fired gun. And that's because, like I said, there's only really two ways that the gun can be handled. It's either basically has a round chambered and ready to fire, or it doesn't. That's really the only two options. What I like about hammer-fired guns is they provide you with a lot more options as far as how you carry it and what kind of safeties are involved in those kinds of things. And the Bersa TPR9C, that's the letter designation for it. It's the Bersa Thunder Pro 9mm Compact, if you want the full name. But TPR9C will bring it up in a search engine well enough. The advantage of a gun like this is it gives you a ton more options than you're going to get with most striker-fired options. And in addition to that, this gun is fairly heavy. And me, I'm someone who's pretty recoil sensitive. And so a gun that is fairly heavy actually appeals to me. Most people want a gun that's fairly light, and to a certain extent I get that. I did get this gun because it is lighter than some other guns that are not as fun to carry, but it's still a pretty heavy gun. This one it depends on which source you read. Some sources say that this is a 23-ounce gun, some say 25. I don't have a scale here to measure. The company that actually imports this, Eagle, they're called Eagle, they say that it's 25, so I'm more inclined to believe them. But if you look it up on Sportsman's Warehouse, they'll say that it's 23. Which of the two it is? Well, get a scale and find out, but I don't have a scale. But like I was saying, this gun has a lot more options than you're going to find with most striker-fired options. There are some striker-fired options out there that do have external safeties and things like that that certainly help for people who are looking for those kinds of options. But what guns like this provide is basically something very different. Alright, so let's talk about the gun in terms of its negatives first, what I don't like about it. Alright, first thing that I don't like about it is that for its size, it is definitely heavy. And like I said, I don't mind heavy so much because I'm recoil sensitive, but maybe a better word for it is bulky. If you take a look at the overhead profile there, you can see that the controls on it stick out a pretty good ways. And my neighbors are absent today. And so if I point the gun in that direction, it's fine. Normally there's people on the other side of that wall, but they are out vacationing this week, so I don't have to worry about that. And you can also notice that from the rear of the profile, and even the handle is still pretty thick as well. So it is not as comfortable as some other guns that are a little bit thinner in profile. It's kind of chunky. So that's one thing that I don't like about it. Another thing that I found that was disappointing was that I get hammer bite from this gun. You know, get a nice high grip on it, choke up on it a little bit, and I don't know how well you can see it, but some of my skin folds over that little tang a little bit, and when the hammer comes down and catches it, and I don't know if you can see or not, but I got a very, 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 very small scar on my hand from where I get a little bit of hammer bite. Now, it wasn't enough to keep me from shooting the gun, and also was not enough to keep me from getting decent accuracy with it, and I'll talk about that when we get into the pros, but it is a negative. I do get hammer bite from this gun, and it is because that tang on the end, which is really short, which is good for concealed carry and those kinds of things, and even just general holster, outside the waistband holster carry. It's good for carry, but when you go to shoot it, it puts the meat of your hand pretty much right into where the hammer comes down. And for me, it rests, it'll come down, hit it, and grab just a little bit. Alright, so I don't like that. What are some other things that I do not like about it? Another thing about it is that it's bulky, it's kind of wide, but also you see that the edges on it are very abrupt. They're not like sharp. It's not like I'm super worried about cutting myself, although there is one exception. The barrel is level with the slide, and so if I do an overhand grab and rack on it and then bring it back with my hand on it, I can catch my palm meet between the breech and the back of the barrel, and that hurts. So I learned very quickly not to do that with this gun. It's either a from the back or it's from the front, but I don't overhand it anymore just because it's too easy to get flesh caught between the breech and the barrel. Alright, so that is a little bit of an issue, but just in general, like I said, it's very, very abrupt edges. Like I said, not sharp for the most part, not worried about cutting myself on most of it, but they are very abrupt. And so there's not really a lot of good transition. And even the tang that's on the back, that tang in one profile is fairly rounded out, but in the other dimension, it's actually very flat and kind of angular, so that even though it's better than the tang on a lot of other guns as far as concealed carry and inside the waistband holsters and things like that, it's still very abrupt, and it will still dig into you just a little bit. Now for me, I wear it a little bit further back around my waist, and so it's not a very big issue, but for other people who might be trying it at a true like 3 o'clock position, or even more forward like appendix carry, the fact that those edges are pretty abrupt could become an issue. And those kinds of things. And also the trigger itself, it does have a little bit of bevel to it, but it's pretty flat, and again, the edges are pretty abrupt. Now, that is nice in that it kind of forces you to use good technique, in that you really have to kind of center your trigger pull on it. You know, can't pull too much to the left or the right. It's not very forgiving and that good. It's good for that, but still just very abrupt edges, just not as smooth out as a lot of other guns. Okay, so that's something that I don't like about it as well. Another thing that I don't like about it, and this is just kind of the fact that Bersa is kind of Bersa is kind of a Beretta clone company. And for those of you who don't know, Bersa was actually started by people who used to work for Beretta. They went off and decided to start their own company. And you'll notice between Beretta and Bersa there are actually a lot of very similar firearms. And that's because, well, these people used to work for Beretta. And one of the things that this gun has that you'll see on some Berettas as well is the transfer bar is outside. This whole block right here is a transfer bar, and when I pull the trigger you'll see it move. Now, on a lot of guns, and especially a lot of modern striker-fired guns, these transfer bars and those kinds of things are all internal to the gun. But this one, it's kind of modeled after certain Berettas and whatnot. It has it external. And for me, being a right-handed shooter, that doesn't really matter too much, especially with my grip. The external transfer bar is no issue that way. But if I was a left-handed shooter, and I do what I normally do, which is I use my offhand index finger on the trigger guard to control the muzzle. Well, when I do it that way, it puts my thumb, my offhand thumb, right on that transfer bar. And so when I'm pulling the trigger, I'm actually moving my thumb. And what that means is that my offhand grip is not going to be as strong as it could be because that thumb has to move. Now, if I lower my hand and take my index finger off of the trigger guard, what that does is it pushes my thumb forward, and then it's not on the transfer bar anymore, and that's okay. You can do it that way. But if you're someone who absolutely loves to have the finger on the trigger guard like I do, and this to me feels like a more natural grip, then yeah, it's going to be right on that transfer bar, and that's going to mess with your grip. And so the gun otherwise is pretty lefty friendly, but if you happen to like to put your offhand index finger on the trigger guard, then it's not so lefty friendly anymore. Just warning you ahead of time, that's what's going on there. Another thing that I found with this gun is that there are a lot of gaps, and I don't know how well you guys will be able to see it on camera, but there are some holes on this thing that you can see daylight through pretty easily. Doesn't look like it's showing up very well on camera here. I apologize for that. But there's quite a few gaps in this gun, and what that tells me is that probably not going to be a good gun to do a med test on. There's lots of ingress points, lots of very open operation. Like I said, the whole transfer bar mechanism is external, and those kinds of guns just don't usually survive in mud tests and those kinds of things very well. Now, it might be okay in sand just because the tolerances are so big that, you know, a lot of sand and everything else is going to fall out of it. But mud and stuff like that, probably not very good. So that is something definitely to be aware of as well. Another thing that's bad about it is that unless you have a magazine in it, where we said this is an empty mag, unless you have that magazine in there that has just a little bit of a foot on it, it's hard to get a full-handed grip on there. Without that magazine, my pinky kind of just dangles there. And I'm glad that they put that extra little bit of surface on the magazine there, but it does make it feel just a little unwieldy. You know, a two-finger grip with a loose pinky doesn't feel all that great, and makes maintaining control a little bit difficult. Okay, another thing that is negative about the gun is that the trigger pull, like a lot of smaller guns, this is a fairly small gun, just for those of you who are kind of having a hard time referencing the size here, this gun is a little bit dimensionally bigger as far as height and length. It's just a little bit bigger than a Glock 26. It's not much bigger, but a little bit bigger than a Glock 26 in height and in length. The only major difference is width. The Glock is, of course, not that wide. This thing is about 1.5 inches wide. It's like 1.45 inches wide, which is pretty wide for a handgun. Okay, it doesn't prohibit me from carrying it. I can still carry it comfortably as long as I have it far enough back on me. So instead of a 3 o'clock position, it's more like a 4 or 5 o'clock position, and then that feels pretty comfortable. But a 3 o'clock position or forward does not feel very comfortable with this gun just because it's so thick. But like I said, if you carry it far enough back, not a big issue, but something to be aware of. But as I was saying, like most smaller guns, this one has a very heavy trigger pull. In double action, go ahead and pull it here, 10 pounds. That's about a 10-pound trigger pull right there. That's pretty heavy for a lot of people. For a lot of people, when they do a double action, single action gun like this, really the target for the double action pull a lot of times is closer to 8 pounds instead of 10 pounds. And so this would throw a lot of people off, and it does require a certain amount of trigger finger strength. And there are some people, not too terribly many, but there are some people that might not actually be able to work this gun all that well when it's in double action mode. Now in single action mode, it is better. It's about a 5-pound trigger pull. But considering that this is already a small gun, when you get both hands on it, I mean, the thing is just absolutely covered in hand meat, and it becomes kind of unwieldy. And even something as small as a 5-pound trigger pull can be a little bit tough to deal with. So that is something to consider. Now, there is something good about the trigger pull, and I'll get to that when I talk about the pros, but for right now, understand that it is fairly heavy. 10-pound double action, about 5-pound single action. Alright, other things that I don't necessarily like about it. We've already talked about the fact that it's kind of bulky. It is heavy, but I don't mind heavy because that's recoil absorption. For me, it is very angular, and in some cases those angles can wind up pinching you. If you do an overhand grab on the slide, that can pinch you. But most of the other time, it's more awkward than anything else. It has an external transfer bar, which I don't like. And another thing that I don't like is that this magazine only holds 13 rounds. Now, I need a fairly low capacity magazine for the jurisdiction that I want to be in that I'm talking about. But a round or two more as far as standard capacity without having to do the one in the chamber thing and stuff like that, having to top off, as people say, would be nice. You know, make the handle just a little bit longer, put a little longer magazine in there, get 14, 15 rounds. That would be really nice. Okay, granted, for what I'm trying to do with it, I can't have too much, but an extra round or two would be nice. Just saying. Alright, so that is pretty much the sum of the things that I don't like. Gives me hammer bites. This tang is more comfortable than other tangs, but because it kind of has some abrupt edges on it, it still will dig into you a little bit depending on how you're carrying it. It's wide, which means the whole gun will kind of dig into you depending on how you're carrying it. Like I said, far enough back, it's not a problem, but if you're trying to carry it further forward or appendix carry, no, just forget it. This is not a good appendix carry gun, just saying. Has a very heavy trigger pull by comparison, especially for the size of gun that you're talking about here. But that pretty much ends the bad things about it. Now let's talk about some of the good things. Good things, like I was mentioning in comparison with striker-fired guns, are options. That is, when you go ahead and you load a round into this gun, like all hammer-fired guns, it's going to push the hammer all the way back, and from here you now have options. On a striker-fired gun, this is exactly how you'd carry it. It's ready to go at any second. On this gun, though, it has a safety cocker. That's the lever that I just pushed up there, and that lever occurs on both sides. It's fully ambidextrous. And the other control that you're seeing up here, that is the slide stop, slide release, and that is also fully ambidextrous as well. But the safety decocker is a nice addition on this gun, in that it does act as a full safety, in that it completely disengages the trigger and also locks up the slide, so you can't pull the slide back. And the hammer itself is actually normally locked anyways from going forward. The only way that the hammer can go all the way forward, it's not going all the way forward right now. It has a little stop on it that keeps it from going all the way forward. The only way it can go all the way forward is if the if the trigger is all the way back while the trigger is engaged, but the safety disengages the trigger completely, so that hammer can never come forward. And it also has an internal drop safety on it, which means that in this configuration, there's almost nothing you can do to it to set it off. If you set it off in this configuration, you are truly talented, and I do not mean that as a good thing, because there's practically no reason why this should go off. The trigger is completely disengaged. It doesn't matter how much that trigger moves, it's not going to go off. Like I said, the hammer is stopped from going all the way forward because there's a little block in there, and then also has a drop safety, internal drop safety on the slide, like a lot of handguns do. And then of course the slide is also locked up as well. In this configuration, there's not a whole lot you can do with it to set it off. Now, and I like that, because what that means is that when I put the gun on safe and I go to holster it, I don't really have to worry about anything happening while I'm holstering it. On a lot of striker-fired guns, if you go to holster them, that's usually the most dangerous part of handling the gun, is holstering it for a striker-fired gun. Because on a normal striker-fired gun, if I'm just using my thumb here, we'll see if you can see that. If it happens to catch on something like your shirt or something as you're putting it into the holster, and you keep pushing, well, you can push on the trigger with a striker-fired gun and it'll go off. This one, though, with the safety on, that trigger is completely disengaged, and so it's not going to do anything. So if I happen to push it into my holster along with, you know, a piece of my shirt or whatever, and push it in there, nothing's going to happen to it. But like a lot of people have a concern who get striker-fired guns, they want the gun to be immediately usable. They don't want to have to worry about taking off the safety. Well, this gun gives you that option as well. Once you've holstered it, you can just go ahead and flip the safety off, and now the gun will be ready to shoot when you draw it out. But I have my thumb in there holding the trigger back, simulating, you know, a piece of fabric or something that catches it up. Well, I just took off the safety and the gun didn't go bang. That's not going to happen. The only way that that's going to happen is if I draw my gun back out and the trigger is allowed to go past the reset point. And then after it goes past the reset point, then after applying that 10 pounds of pressure, then I can get it to go off. So while it's in the holster, as long as I put it in the holster with the safety on to begin with, it can get caught up on something and take that safety off, it's not going to go off. It's not going to go off until it is completely released and that trigger resets and that 10 pounds of pressure is overcome. Those are options that striker-fired guns do not have, which I greatly appreciate. You know, there's been people who know that I carry guns, and I tend to be a little bit of a fidget, unfortunately, and so I'll readjust from time to time, not because I necessarily have to, it's just because I'm a fidget, and that's what I do. And people will make jokes, you know, well, make sure you don't shoot yourself in the leg or something, John. Well, with the guns that I carry, I am far safer with them than, I'm far safer handling them than the vast majority of government employees who carry guns are with their guns, because most of them carry striker-fired guns, and I guarantee you that the way that they carry and the systems in which they carry are much more prone to negligent and accidental discharges than the kinds of systems that I use. Like I said, as long as I put it into the holster on safe, it can get caught up on just about anything, disengage it, and it's not going to go off even then. It doesn't go off until whatever it's caught up on is actually fully released and that 10 pounds of pressure is completely overcome. Striker-fired guns don't do that. They're not simply as safe as these kinds of guns are. Okay, so I like that it has those kinds of options that other guns simply do not have. Another thing that this one has, because it's a Bersa, and a lot of Bersas are like this, you see this little ring down here, and that is a frame lockup. And people, of course, are very different opinions on frame lockups, and that you know, one of the disadvantages of a frame lockup is that if you lock it up, it will lock up the gun completely. It'll lock it up so you can't even disassemble it to clean it. Everything on it locks up when you turn that little dial in there. There's a little key that it comes with that you stick in there and twist, and it completely locks up the gun. And as far as being able to get your gun out to use it, you know, in a, say, a home defense scenario, and you really wouldn't want to wear it around with the frame lockup on it, that would be greatly purpose defeating. But the problem is that frame lockup takes quite a bit of time to disengage, because it's a fairly small little hole. The key for it is also fairly small. It takes quite a while to fiddle around with it and get it out. But is there a reason to have a frame lockup on a gun? And the answer for that is yes. And the answer to that is yes. Bersa makes their guns so that they're basically the only thing that you have to buy aside from ammo. That is, there's a lot of places that will require that you get some kind of safety storage for your gun, which is not a bad practice. I don't like it when jurisdictions force it on people, though. I, as an American, find that to be highly questionable in terms of the Constitution and the original intent of the Founding Fathers. But it is nice, just as not necessarily an item of law, but as a matter of ethics, to secure the gun. And that frame lockup that Bersa puts on their guns, that they can give you a special key to unlock it and unlock it, that it basically allows you to have a locked gun without actually having to get a safe or a special case for it or a lockbox or something like that. Bersa designed their guns so that if you are on a budget and you can only afford the gun and some ammo, that will be sufficient for your purposes. So when the gun is not in use, when it would normally be in storage and locked up, it's not actually in storage and locked up. You just twist the frame lockup on it, and that's basically as good, because the keys for these things are unique. Every Bersa key is a little bit different, and so if you go and get someone else's Bersa lockup key, it's not necessarily going to work on this gun. So they're unique just as much as a lock for a lockbox is, and it completely deactivates the gun. You can't load it when it's like that. You cannot pull the trigger when it's like that. You can't disassemble it when it's like that. It's completely locked up. So there is a purpose to it. It is for people who need to be able to secure their gun without a lockbox or a safe. Now, that it would be people who simply cannot afford a lockbox or safe, or people who might decide to leave their gun in their car from time to time. That is, there are some buildings, unfortunately, in which you're not allowed to carry a gun, even if you have a concealed carry permit, even if your state is a constitutional carry state. By federal law, there are certain buildings that you cannot go into with a gun. And so you wind up having to leave the gun in the car, which is a problem because now you have a gun sitting in your car. And frankly, car windows are fairly easy to break if someone happens to see that you have a gun in there, and you shouldn't leave it in plain view, first of all. Or just someone happens to know that you have a gun and they see you go into a building where they know that you're not allowed to have it, means you probably took it off. There's not a whole lot to keep them from breaking in a window and rifling around and stuff and getting it. Well, if you engage the frame lock while it's in the car, yeah, you're not necessarily going to keep people from getting the gun, but you will be able to keep them at least from using it, at least easily and readily. And so for some people who leave their gun in the car fairly often, having that frame lock up provides a little bit of sense of security for them, knowing that even if somebody does get to the gun, they're not going to be able to use it, at least not easily. Alright, so those are some of those features. Now, one thing that I don't like about the whole system that it has here is that, you know, when you chamber around, hammer goes down, and then you put it on safe, the safety always puts it into the decocked position, into the double action mode. I don't like that there's no option to do fully cocked with the lock on like some hammer-fired guns do. For example, the 1911 was designed for hammer all the way back with the safety on. This gun, that's not an option. If you put the safety on, it's going to bring the hammer forward. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it does mean that that first trigger pull is going to be a bit of a doozy. Now, if you take the safety off, then yeah, you can put it back into single action mode. But that trigger in single action mode isn't very heavy. It is 5 pounds, which is kind of heavy for a gun this size, but that's still not overly heavy. Something to consider there. Having it in double action mode is safer that way. It's more resistance to have to overcome. But again, I like having options. And the fact that the safety always brings the hammer forward, you know, takes away one more option for me. One thing that I do like about this gun, though, is that most of the controls are either ambi, or in the case of the magazine release, it's very easily swappable. So right now it's in the right-handed configuration. So the magazine release is on the left side of the gun. But if you look on the right side, you'll see that there's actually a little screw there, meaning that if you want to swap out the magazine release, all that you need is a correctly sized screwdriver, and that's it. No special pins or punches or anything like that. Just a flathead screwdriver of the appropriate size, and you can switch that out. The other controls are fully ambidextrous. So for a left-handed person, this gun's pretty easy to convert over. Now, like I said, there is the issue with the transfer bar, depending on how you hold the gun as a lefty. If you do a offhand index on the trigger guard, like I do, then your thumb is going to be right on that transfer bar, and it's going to move your thumb with it. There's the transfer bar moving. And so if I put my hand up there like that, it'll be moving underneath my thumb, and that's not good. But like I said, if you do a hand under, thumb up, then you're not going to be on the transfer bar, and it's not an issue. So that one, if you're a left-handed person, this might be a good gun for you, depending on how you hold your guns, just because of that external transfer bar. Alright, another thing that I like about it, and like I said, my neighbors are on that side are not there today, but another thing I like about it is that sight picture. As you can see, it's a 3-dot system, and the front sight is bigger than the ones in the rear. And surprisingly, I was actually able to do better with this gun than with my other gun that was appropriate for that jurisdiction that had a relatively small magazine capacity. This one is a little bit smaller than it. I lose about 1/4 of an inch in sight radius, but with this one, with these nice fairly readily seeable white dot sighting system, 3-dot white sighting system, it's pretty good. and so it wound up being better than the other one. And even if you don't have enough backlight to use the white dots, the posts are still pretty good as well. So if you're someone who happens to like just the simple 3-post system for sighting in, it works pretty well that way too, even if you don't have enough backlight to really see the white dots. So not bad in that regard. Another thing I like about it is the takedown on it is very simple. It has a dedicated takedown lever right here in front. And so I'm just going to push this takedown lever down. Well, here it's up, but if the gun was the normal direction, it would be down. And then the slide pops right off. And then inside the slide, you take out the spring like you normally do, and the barrel comes out, and that's pretty much your disassembled gun right there. Take out the spring, take out the barrel, you're done. And then to reassemble it, just go ahead and slide the barrel right back on. Make sure it's flush with the back. Twist that lever around so that it's flat again. Function check, make sure it caught it, and it's good to go. So really easy takedown on it. I like that about it. Now, one thing I did notice about this gun is that it tends to be very thirsty as far as oil. Most of the external surfaces will just ooze and seep oil, and oil doesn't tend to, you don't need a very thick coating for the outside of the gun. But the barrel, especially the inside of the barrel, does not take oil very well. It tends to dry out in the barrel for some reason, and I'm not exactly sure why, but the barrel needs a decent amount of lubricant, and fairly readily, especially on the interior. So keep that in mind. But like I said, the accuracy was actually better than my CZ75 Compact, and I wouldn't say that the CZ75 Compact is a bad gun. It's not. But for me, with my eyes, with these sights, I don't think it's an issue of the barrels necessarily being more accurate. I think it's mostly a sight system, and for me, the 3-dot system on these sights here just seems to work better for my eyes. The other gun has some kind of pseudo night sights. They're the phosphorus ones that you shine a bit of light on them and then they glow in the dark for a little bit while after, but they're not super bright in the daytime, and also not super bright at nighttime either. And I just can't focus on them as well. These ones, though, I tend to be able to focus on them pretty well. Not my most accurate handgun of all. I'm much more accurate with my 22 Magnum than anything else, and that's just because I'm recoil sensitive, and 22 Magnum doesn't have a lot of recoil. But for larger caliber guns, this one isn't bad. It's at least comparable with my other 9mm. And like I mentioned before, I like that it's heavy, because that helps absorb a little bit of recoil. Another thing that helps absorb a little bit of recoil is the slide itself. The slide is where most of the weight is. The frame is metal, but it's an alloy frame, so there's not a lot of weight down there. Most of the weight is in the slide, and that helps absorb recoil. The slide is what moves when you pull the trigger, and that's moving over in my hand, and so it's not pulling up on me as much. So that part is nice. Another interesting thing about it is that this is definitely a free-floating barrel design. Now, it's not a true Browning design in that it doesn't have distinct locking lugs. Instead, it is, what is it? The Browning Peter design? Something like that. It's basically a hybrid system. So it doesn't have true locking lugs on it, but as you can see, that barrel has quite a bit of tilt on it. Compared to the axis of the gun, when the slide comes all the way back, that barrel tilts pretty aggressively. And that makes it a very reliable gun in terms of different kinds of ammunition. So far, this thing has eaten pretty much everything that I fed it. Light ball rounds, fairly normal ball rounds, hollow points, pretty much anything that you can put in this thing of varying weights, it seems to take just fine. Part of it is the fact that it has a tilt barrel design that's pretty aggressive, especially for the size of gun. And that tilting barrel helps it pick up the next round, but it also helps in recoil management because it redirects some of the force. And so even though it's a smaller gun than any of my other ones, its recoil is not significantly worse than them. The only thing that I really don't like in terms of recoil with this gun is that recoil coincides with some hammer bites. Like I said, it's not a ton. You can barely even see the little scar, but there is some hammer bite, and that is unfortunate. But other than that, fairly straightforward gun. Another interesting thing about it is that on the top, right there is a loaded chamber indicator, and it's basically just a little lever that pops up ever so slightly, so that if you were to run your finger across it, you could catch that little edge and know that you have a round in the chamber. Or you could be a responsible gun owner and just check your chamber. Just saying. I don't typically like loaded chamber indicators too much, in that they tend to breed a certain amount of laziness in people. It's not a bad thing to have, but like I said, it can get you out of the habit of actually checking the chamber directly. And this one does have a little bit of a chamber gap on it, like most guns do. And so I can see in there, and I can see the brass, and I can see if it's loaded or not. So that's another way to check as well. But there's nothing that beats just checking the gun. But yeah. Alright, so that is the Bersa Thunder Pro 9mm Compact, or the TPR9C. Final recommendation, or not. Is this a gun that I would recommend for everyone? And the answer to that is no. For people who are looking at a gun that's this size, a lot of people are going to want something that's not as bulky, and they're going to want something that's lighter. Because for most people, when they're going down to a gun this size, their primary concern is practicality. That is, how practical is it to carry this thing around? That is, people who get guns this size are usually not overly concerned about safety. They are, otherwise they wouldn't have a gun. But they're usually not overly concerned. You know, they don't feel like there's enough of the threat on their life to carry around, you know, a full-size handgun or a rifle or something like that. They want something that's there if they need it, but not much more than that. And they certainly don't want it to get in the way. Well, this one, it kind of does get in the way. For me, it's good, because I like hammer-fired guns. I like the options that they give. And I also do like heavier, bulkier guns, just because I'm so recoil sensitive. So for me, it's a good pick. But for most other people who aren't recoil sensitive, and who frankly may not be willing to put up with the weights or the bulk, like I said, it's just kind of a wide, bulky gun with some very abrupt edges and angles, and it's just kind of awkward that way. For a lot of people who are in that category who don't want to put up with that, this is not going to be a good gun. They might be better off with the Glock 26 or something like that. Who knows? And then there's other options out there, even in the hammer-fired category, that might be better as well. Some of the SIGs are not too bad in terms of width and weights. SIGs do tend to be a little bit heavier, but the width, they do typically have a better width than this. And so they're not going to be quite as bulky as that way. Also might be a little bit smaller, a little bit shorter. So overall, not bad. There are guns that will fill this niche that are better than this gun in terms of the bulkiness and the weight. And if you're looking for, you know, just a little, you know, pocket gun to have on you just in case, well, this isn't a little pocket gun. Yes, it's smaller than a lot of other handguns, but this is still not quite pocket gun size. This is something that you still are going to want to run in a holster or very large pant pockets. You know, guys with cargo pants. It doesn't usually work so well for the ladies. You might be able to run this, but for a lot of people in most of their applications that want a small gun, they're going to want a gun that is smaller and lighter than this. But like I said, if you are someone who happens to like single double action guns, you like having all of the safety options that this one gives you, because like I said, with the safety on, it completely disengages that trigger, so you can load it into the holster, it get caught up on whatever, take the safety off so that it's ready to fire when you draw it. You're not giving up your ability to fire this gun when you need to, as long as you remember to disengage the safety as soon as you holster it. And even if it gets caught up on something, getting caught up on something isn't going to mean anything until it is basically drawn out of the holster and that trigger resets all the way. You point it at the target, you overcome those 10 pounds of pressure, and you send it around down range. So very, very, very safe gun. Put it on safe, holster it. If it happens to get caught up on something, yeah, that's not ideal, and you always want to check to make sure that it's not caught up on something. But with this particular gun, because that trigger is completely disengaged, it's not as likely to be catastrophic with this gun as with others. So you holster it on safe, flip it off safe, so that when you draw it, you're ready to immediately fire. Pretty good design that way. It's still ready to go when you need it, but very safe when holstering it, and that is usually most people's major problem with gun safety. Is the most dangerous time for most people is when they're holstering their gun. This one takes a lot of that. You still need to be cognizant of what's going on. You still need to be aware. You still need to take due precautions, but it does take a lot of the problems that can occur when reholstering gun out of the equation. Like I said, load it, put it on safe, holster it, and then once you've got it holstered, and check and make sure that nothing's hung up on it, because you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't tolerate that. I'm just saying that if it does happen, it's not going to be as catastrophic with this gun as with others. Check and make sure that there's nothing that's hung up in the holster, that the trigger guard area is fully secured, and then once you've done that, disengage the safety, and then when you draw it, you can still fire it without having to worry about the safety, because you've already disengaged the safety. And that first shot is going to be that 10-pound trigger pull. It's going to be hard to overcome. Might not be as accurate as you'd like, but the chances of it accidentally going off, fairly minimal. All right, and then just for those of you who are wondering about the magazine, yes, empty magazine. This is an actually ejecting magazine. As you can see, it actually spits it out. It's not just a drop magazine. There's actually a little bit of force behind it that'll kick it out there for you. So a one-handed magazine change. I've never seen anyone actually do a truly one-handed magazine change. This means that you're only holding onto the gun with one hand. You can do. So drop, other hand reaches for your spare magazine, put the spare magazine in, you're good to go. And like I said, it is a positive ejection on that one. Alright, last safety check. No magazine. And I can feel that there's nothing in the chamber. Put the safety on. Take it off. We're good to go. Alright, thank you very much for watching my review of the Bersa Thunder Pro 9mm Compact. Like I said, for most people, they're probably going to want something that's lighter and something that's not as bulky. But if you're like me and you're recoil sensitive, having something that's a little bit heavier helps with that. And if you happen to like all of the extra features that the gun has in terms of being able to holster it while safe, then take the safety off pretty easily, those kinds of things, then with all those kinds of things in mind, and also if you happen to live in a area in a jurisdiction, or you happen to visit a jurisdiction fairly often that limits the size of magazine that you can have, all those things combined, then it might be a good gun for you. For me, I would consider it to be a good gun. And it's even more accurate than, at least as far as the sighting system with my eyes, it's more accurate than some of my other ones. But what is going to be best for you in your situation, that's something that you're going to be responsible for and you're going to have to give due consideration to. But hopefully, this gives you one more thing to think about. This gives you options. And like I said, as a gun owner, one of the things I love most is options. I want to have a gun that that tailors to my needs as best as possible. And for my particular situation, going to the jurisdiction that I do, them having a magazine ban, and me being someone who likes double single action guns, and happening to like this particular style of single double action, that it's a dual-sided kind of system that allows me to access it even while it's in the holster pretty easily, all those kinds of things. For me, it winds up being a pretty good option. I don't like the hammer bite, but again, it's fairly small and certainly not enough to keep me from firing the gun, so not bad. For me, it's a good option. For you though, maybe not. It just depends. But options are a good thing, and if especially you are an American gun owner, you're going to have a lot more options available to you than other people would. And that is not a bad thing. That's actually a very good thing. And I hope that if you are an American gun owner, you appreciate that fact, that we can look at guns like this that actually are pretty excellent for what they are. And like I said, this thing feeds just about anything. It's basically just a discount Beretta. And for those of you who are wondering, I got this for about $400. Of course, that's going to vary from area to area, but Bersas are not typically very expensive guns. Something in the $200 to $400 range is usually what Bersas come in at, depending on the specific model that you're looking for and the location in which you're buying it from. Usually somewhere in the high 200s to the low 400s is what you'll get them for. And like I said, that includes a lot of other models, not just this particular 9mm. So good quality, good bang for the buck in that sense. But in America, you're not stuck with this. This is a great gun. But there are also a lot of other great guns that are out there as well. And that is one of the great things about being in America, where we love capitalism. And capitalism fosters options. When the consumer says, I want options, and you live in a capitalistic society, then the producers have to tailor to those needs, otherwise they don't get customers. Somebody else, they will tailor to the customer's needs, and they'll make a gun that has those options, and they'll get all the business. That's one of the beautiful things about being in America, being in a capitalistic society does for you. It gives you options. Is this going to be the best for everyone? No, it's good for me in my situation, but it might not be good for you in your situation. And you shouldn't be forced to have it. And at the same time, those other options, they weren't good for me. A Glock 26 would not be a good gun for me. I do not like striker-fired guns. I do not like that every trigger pull is the same in terms of holstering issues. Okay, Glocks and other striker-fired guns are just not as safe to holster as guns like this are. So for me, that would be a really bad option for me. But since I live in America and we have a whole lot of different manufacturers out there that are competing with each other, you get guns with a whole lot of different options. And that is really stinking cool. All right. Lectured enough about quite a few different things on that one. Like I said before, thank you very much for your time and attention. Go with God and be blessed. Bye.